Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. What comes to mind when we say he's a communist? Is it often pejorative, offensive, a slur? But what of the often neglected 100-year history of the Communist Party in the United States? A history that supported American labor, the peace movement, anti-imperialism, civil rights, and defended democracy. Today we interview a fellow who lectures and writes on the subject. And by the way, he's a communist. Hello, warm greetings, Greg and Tony. And today we welcome Tony Pecinovsky, who is the president of the St. Louis Workers Society and a prominent author and historian regarding the Communist Party USA. And I'm really glad to have you on our podcast today. And I will be discussing two of your three books. One is the book Them Tremble, and that is a book about 100-year history of the Communist Party. And then the second one is the sixth biography in this book is a more specific book about one of the more prominent members, which was Alpheus Hunton and the Cancer of Colonialism. And so here we go. Glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Good. And I didn't mention your second book, which I have not read. It's called Faith in Masses, 12 Essays on Various Aspects of the 100-Year History of the Communist Party. Give me a little bit about that book before we dive into your others.
Okay. Well, Faith in the Masses is a collection of 12 essays by historians, academics, and scholar activists who each in their own way, in their own individual essays, address and celebrate the history of the Communist Party and its contributions over the past 100 years. And so the various essays in that collection look at different topics, from the desegregation of baseball and the Communist Party's role in that campaign. It looks at the role of prominent communists like Virginia Brodeen, who was an early supporter and leader of the movement for environmental sustainability. We also look at the Charles Ruthenberg, who was the first leader of the merged Communist Party in 1920, 1921, who has not gotten much historical recognition within communist circles and outside of communist circles. And so these various essays, 12 in total, look at this 100-year history of the Communist Party from these various angles, but they all conclude with the same conclusion, which is that the Communist Party, from all of these different perspectives, helped to lead the struggle for workers' rights, African-American equality, peace, solidarity, internationalism. My essay in that collection looks at the role of the Communist Party in the early 1960s and 1970s movements around the student free speech movements, the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War movement, and the emergence of communist-led groups like the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and the National Anti-Imperialist Movement with Solidarity in Africa.
Right.
And so the essays address the history of the Communist Party from a number of different angles.
So let's just talk about the Communist Party USA. So it's the CPUSA, Communist Party USA. So it's 100 years old, began in about 1919, and it picked up big steam in 1930s, 40s, 50s, with its involvement in the labor movement and anti-Jim Crow and so forth. And Greg and I have done multiple books on that, and well, we've done a handful of podcasts regarding that specific subject. And then you had the Red Scare and the horrific purging that went on at that particular time. Was that 56 or so with McCarthy, right?
Well, the initial beginnings of the Red Scare was 48.
48. And I kind of thought that, well, that's when this all stopped, because they made it so difficult with all of the various acts and legislation associated with that. But you were born, you're my son's age, you're 40, what are you, 40? Yeah, 44. And you picked up and talked about it going through the 60s and 70s and to the current state today. And that's kind of the history doesn't stop with McCarthy. The history continues, but it changes, right?
Yes.
Right. And that's where you with this book, Let Them Tremble, you have 6 biographies from early until today, and you tell a story through these six people, various aspects of the history of the Communist Party. Tell us about that book and how you approach this subject with that.
Okay. Well, first, the personalities that are discussed in that book include Arnold Johnson, Charlene Mitchell, Gus Hall, Henry Winston, Judith LeBlanc, and W. Alpheus Hunton. And the main goal of Let Them Tremble was to push the historical narrative forward post 1956. As you noted, many, if not most, histories of the Communist Party tend to end in 1956, which was, one of the hallmark years in the history of the Communist Party, with the Khrushchev revelations of the crimes committed in the Soviet Union against the Soviet people and socialism. And so the CPUSA was not immune to the effects of that impact. A number of communists left the CPUSA at that time. And so you have this kind of confluence of different factors that led to a weakening of the CPUSA. So you have, starting in 1948, the initial jailing of the top leadership of the CPUSA. And then you have, from that point forward, a ongoing pernicious assault on civil liberties, where the Communist Party was the main target throughout the late 1940s into the early and mid 1950s, culminating with this announcement by Khrushchev of the crimes in the Soviet Union. And so most histories of the Communist Party tend to end in 1956 as if the Communist Party ceased to be, as if it no longer played any sort of impactful role in the workers' rights, peace, civil rights, etc. movements in the United States and internationally. And so my book, Let Them Tremble, forces the historical narrative forward and asks the reader to, ask the reader the question of, well, is that really the fact? And what I found was, in doing research on the Communist Party in the post-1956 period, is that most of those narratives just do not square with the historical record. The historical record is replete with example after example after example of the role of communists in the post-1956 period, providing leadership to the struggles for free speech, civil rights, peace, against political and racist repression, for international solidarity, and the birth of what became known as the constituent groups within the AFL-CIO, which was, CLU, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, CBTU, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, etc. And so the main goal of Let Them Tremble, as told through these 6 biographies, is to push this historical narrative forward post-1956.
Good. Start with Arnold Johnson.
Why don't we discuss that, Pat? Why don't we discuss that? Because I think it's very, very important to understand that the things that are holding politics back in the United States today, and have for 100 years, is the twin ugliness of anti-communism and racism. And the anti-communism didn't begin in 1948, and it didn't end in 1956. And I appreciate Tony's work, but I think the thing to focus on in the 50s is the repression of the Communist Party, the destruction of the party's cadre and the labor movement. The harm that was done there continues to this day. The essential outlawing of the Communist Party didn't just affect the Communist Party and its cadres, it affected liberals. Liberals today are afraid to speak. They're afraid to take a position because the residue of anti-communism exists even today. The insanity of some of our politics today, the grouplets, the ideological confusions that flow today, flow out of that, out of knocking out a central pole in US politics with the harm to the Communist Party. And so, I mean, I don't think it's so much the Khrushchev revelations as it was the incredible repression. And I joined the Communist Party in 1975, and I can attest to what Tony said. I remember my first activity was around the National Alliance, Wilmington 10, and that defense. It came after the Angela Davis campaign. And there was no one doing that in that period. No one was doing that. The party pushed that. The party pushed most of the anti-racist initiatives of that era. TUAD, which was a party created group within the labor movement, which really pushed the labor movement hard. Its absence today, unfortunately, is why we have a labor movement that's in many ways so backward. So, I mean, I think we really need to look at those people. I had the pleasure of meeting many times Gus Hall and Henry Winston. These were giants. And I really thank Tony for putting this forward. We had Tony Montero on, talked about Henry Winston, a giant figure who's almost lost today. And I just want to say it's so exciting to know that Tony and others, the Black radical tradition that's coming forward today, is bringing a lot of these communist leaders to the forefront. What a tradition that's been cut off from the American people. And so just from my perspective, I want to thank you, Tony, for continuing that as a younger person who didn't know many of these people. I knew Charlie Mitchell from the Alliance. What they were struggling against, it's incredible forces that were arrayed against the Communist Party. And yet these folks still persevered. And I got to know a lot of the older people, old timers or rank and filers, who suffered during that period enormously. Their stories should be told. I try to keep those stories alive among my friends. So it's a rich tradition, and we owe a lot to the Tonys and others like him that are bringing that forward today. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Well, and I'd like to add one thing, Tony, or Greg. You know, you said the wholesale condemnation of the party. Well, Tony, you wrote an interesting article just a year ago when CNN reporters compared the January 6th, which is a year ago today. They compared that to the Communist Party and the Smith Act and getting rid of all these subversives, and it was so distorted with such mendacity that's our mainstream news. That was amazing. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, that's so that article appeared, I guess, a few days after the assault on the Capitol last year, and CNN, journalist wrote this article, and it was based off of some research that some scholars had done at the University of Illinois, I think, and they tried to document and map the history of coup attempts, and somehow or another, this assault on the civil liberties of communists gets twisted by intellectual somersaults into the Communist Party being the leader of a coup attempt, and it is completely outrageous. Of course, we all know that the Communist Party was the victim in this assault on civil liberties, that hundreds of communists were hounded, hundreds of communists were denied their civil liberties on the most outrageous of charges, stemming from their understanding of Marxism-Leninism, and their internationalist outlooks and relationships to other movements and leaders throughout the world. And so this somersault, this intellectual somersault that took place by CNN was absolutely outrageous. And so what we did was we began a campaign to identify signatories who would be willing to sign on to a letter to CNN documenting how this article was outrageous, documenting how it twisted and upended facts, how it did not square with the historical record. And we ended up getting 40, 50, 60, I don't know, maybe 100 different academics who signed on to this letter, and as well as prominent people like Angela Davis, who had once been one of the leading figures in the Communist Party, and submitted this letter to not only CNN, but also to this Coup Project group at the University of Illinois. The Coup Project group, I forget the exact name of the organization, issued a statement saying that CNN had actually misrepresented their findings. They still labeled the CPUSA as conspirators in some sense of the word. But this group actually came out and said that CNN did in fact misrepresent. CNN had to go back and re-authored this article, rewrite this article 2 or 3 different times. I mean, in what should have been a huge embarrassment for CNN and for the author of this article. When we reached out to CNN directly, they did not respond. There was no response to our inquiries, and they refused to even acknowledge the history of the Communist Party and its contributions to the struggle for democracy, civil rights, workers' rights and peace, etc., and how this article in particular, did not square with the historical record. And then we also saw that this article was regurgitated hundreds of times by local media networks, local newspapers, regurgitated this nonsense. And that's how, I think that's partly how this myth of communists as being coup plotters, as being against democracy, etc., continues to perpetuate.
And related to that, I watch Fox News sometimes, just because I get such enjoyment about how remarkably effective they are as propagandists. So today, the major networks are covering the Schumer, talking about the January thing, and Fox News was just showing loops and loops and loops of people rioting in Portland and calling them anarchist and communists. It's just like, oh my God, I guess you can still get some mileage out of that, but and trying to make the equivalency that these, patriots that were trying to correct things in DC a year ago are the same as these kind of nihilist little punk kids in Portland. So anyway, go back to Arnold Johnson. And speaking of that, such a remarkable defender of the Bill of Rights, and he was tell me a little bit about that. Born in Seattle.
Well, Arnold Johnson's story is pretty interesting. He's a personality that came to New York to work at the party national headquarters in 1947 or so, was instantly embroiled in controversy as he and other communists began to feel the early effects of the Red Scare, and they were banned from speaking on college and university campuses there in New York. And so Arnold Johnson's story kind of starts from his early defense of the Bill of Rights in 1947, 1948, and linking the persecution of communists and the persecution of African Americans and other people to this assault on the Bill of Rights. And so this chapter in Let Them Tremble really centers on Johnson's lifelong commitment to and speaking about the defense of the Bill of Rights. And so, and then I kind of followed Johnson's career throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and we find that he becomes a leader within the party and outside of the party in the emerging peace movement, the anti-Vietnam War peace movement, and that the party, though never regaining the numbers that it had in the 1940s, early 1930s, 1940s, still played a very substantial role in the anti-Vietnam War peace movement. And Arnold Johnson at this time was the chair of the party's Peace Commission. Of course, we find other communists who played very important instrumental leadership roles. I don't know if folks have paid much attention to the history of the Fort Hood Three, but two of the Fort Hood Three, who were the three first soldiers to refuse to deploy to Vietnam in 1966, I think, two of those three were members of the Communist Party. And so that's one example of the role of communists in the early movement against the war in Vietnam. Another example is the work of Herbert Aptheker and his delegation to Hanoi in 1965. And of course, Arnold Johnson was part and parcel of all of these various movements that emerged to fight for peace as the United States government was escalating its attack on the Vietnamese government.
And I find something, he was then one of the victims of the Smith Act, and which is it's this thought police, just even thinking and discussing Marxism and so forth, put you in the crosshairs where your career and livelihood could be impacted. And he was one of the first that his career was scuttled by that, which reminds me, I have a new hat, says, make Orwell fiction again. And, and to a certain extent, that was what was going on with the Smith Act. Just this wholesale purge of destruction of the party at that time. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see some...
Well, I mean, there was this attempt to destroy the party. As I argue, of course, that attempt was only partly successful. But we also find, and you mentioned a couple minutes ago, Johnson attended seminary when he was younger and had actually had every intention of going into a religious career. And so what we find is in some of my research on Arnold Johnson and his correspondences throughout that period of the early 1950s and into the mid 1950s, is that he continued to have a vibrant dialogue and relationship with religious leaders, who many of whom came to the support of Johnson and other communists despite the repression that was they were faced with. And so I think this is another important part of this history. Yes, there was this ramified attempt to destroy the Communist Party, to beat it into submission, yet from quarters that we may not usually suspect came support. And one of those quarters was the religious community.
Huh, that's interesting.
Well, let's have a little balance, though. In Pittsburgh and in cities across the country, the Catholic Church organized very actively to destroy the left-wing trade union movement. There was a number of clerical people who did support Communist Party and had the courage to stand up, but it was a wave of anti-communism, and the Catholic Church's role in it to be faithful to truth, to start truth. We've got to point that out. In Pittsburgh was Father Rice, ACTU, Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, who destroyed essentially the left wing and the United Electrical Workers Union, destroyed it, and that was all through the CIO. They went after them. So religion, there were people that came forward, but there were lots and lots of people who attacked the Communist Party. And it wasn't just an attack on the Communist Party, it was an attack on progress. And let's not make any mistake about it. It was an attack on the labor movement. It was an attack on democratic rights. It was a wholesale attack on everything that had been gained in the 30s, especially in the 30s.
Right. Right.
And today we still haven't even regained all of that was lost during that period. And the lack of a Communist Party in the labor movement in a strong way is just glaring. Nothing has replaced it. Nothing has replaced it.
Absolutely. The impact of Taft-Hartley, the impact of the purging of the communist leadership within the CIO, had a devastating impact on the labor movement in the United States. I think if we look at the history of the Communist Party and its role in the CIO, especially prior to the purging of communists, the CPUSA members at that time led a combined union membership of around 1 million people. That's nothing to sneeze at. And oftentimes those unions were the most progressive when it came to diversity, when it came to internal democracy, when it came to transparency in finances, when it came to other questions around seniority and the advancement of people of color and women. And so I agree 100% with that. I think Arnold Johnson's experience in as a party organizer and leader also lends itself to this other perspective that in spite of all of this repression, there were still a few people of courage who were willing to stand up and challenge this assault.
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but the treason of liberals in that era was a critical component and allowed the Communist Party to be devastated in the way it was.
Explain more about that. You said the treason of liberals? Is that
liberalism, the Popular Front era, which people familiar with that history know well, when there was a collaboration between the communist and the liberal community, broad-based liberal community, what people today call progressives. And that, as soon as the first shots in the Cold War began, and when the first attacks upon the Communist Party began, they began to run. And first it was a few on the fringes, then it was a wholesale panic by the early 50s. The liberals had abandoned the Communist Party, left them to their fate, essentially, and joined the Cold War. And that's the reality. And, I'd like to be nice to them. I like to be nice to liberals, but unfortunately on this topic, you can't be nice to liberals. And if you look around and see today, the lack of a spine among many progressives, among many elements within the Democratic Party, you can trace it right back to that period. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that's familiar with that history. Liberals cannot be counted on.
We see examples of that with the kind of tension between, and that's, I guess, putting it politely, but the tension between the communist-led Civil Rights Congress and the Council on African Affairs, as opposed to the role of the NAACP during this period. I mean, that's one example of this, that you're talking about. And I think that, that not only was a disservice to progress in general, but it was also, as Gerald Horne has noted, a disservice to the Black community in particular. And so I think that also needs to be studied and understood much more broadly.
I appreciate folks that we're all looking forward to a time when we can bring people back together again, and we can have a strong left socialist-oriented movement and draw allies to it. And of course I want to see that, but in terms of my respect and regard for the Communist Party tradition, I have to be honest about what liberals have done. I have to be honest about their role in U.S. politics in that period, and more importantly, the remnants of that, how it resounds today through all of our issues. And it's important to understand that historically in order for us to get beyond it. It'd be nice if we could just shrug our shoulders, with no reconciliation with that period, but we really can't, because we're seeing much of, at a time like today when, frankly, in my opinion, things are falling apart very quickly. We don't have time. We have to reconcile and we have to go forward, but we have to understand that period and understand who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. To talk about Charlene Mitchell, African-American feminist. The Communist Party did a pretty good job, a very good job, of integrating Black Americans into their organization, and a reasonable job with women. Would you say that? Not as good,
Reasonable.
but reasonable.
Do you mean the party? The party continued to be a largely masculinist organization throughout much of its history, but I think when compared to other organizations during the time, it was above and beyond, what the other organizations were doing. And so it's a mixed history. I think there's definitely room for improvement, but when you look at, for example, the history of Charlene Mitchell and the party's role in trying to propel forward this issue of Black women communists who ran for president of the United States in 1968. And one of the reasons why I wanted to focus and devote a chapter to Charlene Mitchell was, again, because her campaign in 1968 for presidency once again challenges this notion of the party's demise post 1956. And so, similar to the wildly successful college and university speaking engagements that Gus Hall, Herbert Aptheker, James Jackson, other leading comrades experienced in the early 1960s, similar to that, Charlene Mitchell and Michael Zagarelli, experienced a similar wave of success in terms of speaking engagements on college and university campuses throughout 1968. Of course, their vote total was minuscule compared to the major party candidates, but that's to be expected living in a capitalist society, and the fact that I think they only made it on the ballot in 2 or 3 states. And so to be expected. But I think Charlene Mitchell's story is really illustrative of this attempt that I wanted to make, and that I hope the readers understand, which is, again, that the Communist Party continued to exist and continued to try to exert a left influence, a left Marxist influence, well past 1956. And so Charlene's campaign in 1968, and then just a year and a half, 2 years later, the arrest of Angela Davis, and Charlene Mitchell becomes the national director of the campaign to free Angela Davis. And then after Angela Davis's acquittal and freedom, Charlene Mitchell becomes the founding chair, and continues in that role for a number of years, of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And as was noted earlier, the National Alliance took on many campaigns dealing with racist and political repression that no one else during that time was willing to touch. And so we mentioned the Wilmington 10, we mentioned, I don't know if it was mentioned earlier, but Joanne Little, of course, the campaign to free Frank Chapman. And so you have these examples throughout the 1970s of the role of the National Alliance that Charlene Mitchell was very much a part of and a leader of. And I think that history has been neglected. It's been whitewashed. It's been, erased from the consciousness of most Americans. And so I really wanted to try to tell her story within the context of a challenge in this narrative.
Right. Gus Hall came to Seattle in 1962, and there was standing room only. Thousands of people came to see him. And I think of the college campuses today, and how even Bill Maher refuses to work them because there's such a backlash with the wokeness gone a bit amok. Gus Hall was a pretty prominent fellow during that anti-war movement and the 60s and 70s. Tell us about him.
Well, Gus Hall's history is really interesting. He was quite a personality and had spent many years as a organizer with the SWOC, Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and kind of was known for being a kind of rough and tumble, big hands type of guy, and working class. And then in 1958, I think, becomes the General Secretary of the Communist Party USA and initiates an attempt to rebuild the party after this decade of political repression, the McCarthy era, the impact of the Smith and McCarran Acts, et cetera. And so what we find is in 1959, 1960 is the emergence of communist-led groups like the Progressive Youth Organizing Committee. We find the Advanced Youth Organization. You find other, communist youth initiatives, as well as in 1964, the birth of the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs. And so this was all an attempt under Gus Hall's leadership and the entire, collective leadership of the Communist Party to rebuild the party among youth and students. And simultaneously, you have this upsurge of student activism on the campuses against the intellectual straitjacket of McCarthyism. And so what was one of the best ways to challenge McCarthyite straitjacket is to invite communists to your campuses. And so you mentioned this speaking engagement West Coast tour that Gus Hall did in early 1962. And it's estimated that just in January or February of 1962, Gus Hall himself spoke with at least 20,000 students on college and university campuses up and down the West Coast. And so this is a phenomenal, wildly successful, speaking tour, but it's not an aberration. What we find is, if we look at the historical record, is that throughout 1961, 1962, 1963, and into 1964, that these wildly successful communist speaking engagements on college and university campuses continued throughout those years, and that the Communist Party accumulatively spoke to, and this is a conservative estimate, accumulatively spoke to at least 100,000 youth and students on college and university campuses during that time. And I use this example of Gus Hall and the Oregon football field that was full of 12,000 students. I mean, can you imagine that today if a communist speaker spoke at a university and there was 12,000 students in attendance? The only other example that I can think of is these mass rallies that Bernie Sanders had into the elections. And so this was an organization that was far from marginal in the early and mid 1960s, far from marginal. And so I used the example of Gus Hall's life and his work throughout this period to document, again, to challenge this narrative that the Communist Party ceased to be a political force post 1956.
Greg, when did you meet Gus Hall? Was that one of those college rallies?
No. I met him when I was in the Communist Party. When he would come to Pittsburgh from time to time. He was a regular on a KDKA radio show. There was a liberal here who fancied himself a liberal, a real liberal, and he always invited Gus to come, and they would spar. And Gus acquitted himself extremely well. And call-ins would come, hostile ones, friendly ones, and the whole deal. But Gus, he was a character, and he could hold his own. I mean, he wasn't afraid to appear on a platform or speak before people. He just was right on his line, and he would push it. And very clear, very, very, very interesting guy. When he got older, as we all do, he hung on to power maybe a little too long, but he's responsible, as I think Tony's alluding, to keeping the Communist Party not only going, but growing during that period. From, I know I was around the party in the late 60s, early 70s, and there was some growth, and we had it. And the thing that impressed me most about the party in that period was that a small number of people, it wasn't really a cadre party, it was organized like a cadre party, but a small number of people, let's say 50 to 100 people in Pittsburgh, could have a powerful political impact they could have in a broader politics. With dedication, they would prove to people their sincerity, how hard they would work, and their selflessness. And one of the great tragedies of this depiction of communists in the 50s is these horrors about their plotting and the fangs and all this stuff, is every communist I ever met, even the ones I didn't like, were selfless. And they had dedicated their life to something. They sacrificed for something. They risked for something. And you could count on it, which I wish you could say today about lots of people in politics. So, I mean, through all that, they were the finest people I ever met. They were the old timers in particular, the ones that were schooled in the 30s, came out of the working class, were steeled by the McCarthy era, and still stuck with it. They were the finest people I ever met, working class people, black and white, that I ever met. And I hope someday to meet people like that again. So I hope to.
Mm-hmm. We did a show with specifically dealing with Henry Winston. And that's the next person on your list, just a remarkable man. Tell us a little bit about him and how you approached his works.
Well, I really tried to approach the life of Henry Winston primarily through his leadership in the national anti-imperialist movement in solidarity with African liberation, which was founded in 1973 and was a program, an organization that was sponsored and led by communists. And its main goal was to eliminate, to destroy apartheid in South Africa. At this time, South Africa was one of the main strategic allies of the United States on that continent, and it was the leadership, in part, not only, but in part, the leadership of Namesol, among others, who helped to break down this apartheid regime by organizing domestically to bring pressure to bear through divestment campaigns, through other political work, speaking at the UN. I think you mentioned Anthony Montero was the leader of Namesol for a number of years, and and others. And one of the things that I found most interesting about Winston was his organizational and intellectual, ideological leadership of Namesol. As I think some people know, he went blind while in prison due to trumped up charges during the McCarthy era. He had been in hiding for a number of years. I think in 1955 he agrees to submit to the FBI and turn himself in, and he spends the next 4 years in prison. Eventually a tumor develops in his brain, and due to prison negligence, he goes blind. And it was only after a worldwide campaign that included people like Dr. Martin Luther King, and A. Philip Randolph and others that Winston was released. Was released by Kennedy. And so he goes to the Soviet Union for a number of years, comes back, is seen as one of the party's leading Black intellectuals, ideological leaders of the party, writing about the struggle for African-American equality and Black liberation, and making the connections between the domestic struggle for equality and the international struggle for liberation. And so out of that, I try to again move the historical narrative forward and talk about Winston's leadership in Namesol, and then his eventual passing in the 1980s. I think it was in 2012, Angela Davis, Charlene Mitchell, and others, Jarvis Tyner from the Communist Party USA had a centennial celebration of the life of Henry Winston, where they, spoke about his amazing contributions. And I think it's really great that you guys had Anthony Montero on to speak about Henry Winston's life and his contributions. At some point, hopefully, somebody will do a book-length proper biography of Winston. I don't think one exists, at least not to my knowledge. And so for the time being, I guess my chapter in Let Them Tremble is probably the only, close to a book-length history of Winston's life. And there's quite a bit that I could not include due to space and time and et cetera. So hopefully at some point somebody will write a proper biography.
Did you ever meet him, Greg? Did you ever meet?
Yeah, in fact, I chaired Daily World, a May Day Daily World fundraiser in Pittsburgh. A large group of people, several hundred people, and Henry Winston was our guest speaker. So I had a chance to spend time with him. More importantly, just to see him, how he operated, how he worked. And I think we ought to broaden the picture of Henry Winston. He wasn't just a leader of NAMSL. He was that, all the things that Tony said, but he was a leader for the party. I mean, he was the chairman of the Communist Party, and Gus often got the spotlight, but Winston really was a strong force in keeping an even keel in the party in that era, and sometimes keeping Gus's exuberance under restraint. But that you'd have to, we'd have to talk to some people that were closer to it than I certainly was. But yeah, most impressive. An honor to have been around him. Yeah, great honor.
And I was interested when Tony was talking about him, Tony Montero. He just was such a kind man, such a good. Everybody spoke of how warm he was and engaging, and even after he's blind from being tortured in prison, he didn't have bitterness. He was a very loving person, and that's nice. We've talked about, the labor movement and Black liberation, and now let's talk about the communists and environmental movements with Judith LeBlanc. Tell me a little bit about Judith.
Well, Judith is a really amazing story, and of all of the communists in Let Them Tremble, Judith is the only one that I actually know personally. And I've had the opportunity to know Judith for the past 20 some odd years. And, when I first met her, she was a leader of the party's cable TV effort called Change in America. Change in America was a public access TV show that was initiated by the Communist Party. And in 1999, 2000, which I joined the party in 98, 99. And so, I had the opportunity to really see the work of Judith as it kind of evolved, and how the role of Change in America, the party was struggling with trying to figure out what was then called the independent media movement. And so you had all of these independent media centers springing up across the country, whether it was local newspapers that were, left, leaning, Marxist, anarchist, etc. All of them published and ran on a volunteer basis. You also had the emergence of, the World Wide Web, and the internet was becoming a much more predominant thing at the time. But the party was struggling with how best to approach this question of independent media. And so they have this initiative called Change in America. And Change in America was really an attempt to be a broad-based news show from a working class Marxist perspective. And what they tried to do was they would film these 30-minute shows, and they would take these shows and they would be the videos would be shown on public access TV, but they would also be shown at union halls and union conventions and this is a really amazing kind of initiative that was taken to try to broaden out the party's reach and the reach of what was, I guess, it was still the People's Weekly World at that time, the party's weekly print publication. And so it was an attempt to kind of merge this independent media movement with public access TV, with working class union hall video shows, with the print publication of the People's Weekly World. And so Change in America existed for maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. And then, of course, Judith moves on to leadership in what was United for Peace and Justice. I think UFPJ still exists, though its role is a little bit different now. But the United for Peace and Justice came together around the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was an attempt to build a broad-based nationwide coalition for peace. And Judith became one of the national co-chairs of United for Peace and Justice, and one of the largest, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it became the largest peace coalition in US history, and was responsible for organizing hundreds of thousands of people to march throughout New York City and Washington, DC, as well as local chapters that would organize their own peace marches and vigils and those types of things. And so Judith's role in United for Peace and Justice is really illustrative, again, of the role of communists trying to broaden the scope of the movement and to play a role that doesn't necessarily emphasize big C communism or big C communist, rather emphasizing the attempt to build broad-based unity. And then more recently, Judith has become the leader of the Native Organizers Alliance, which has been instrumental in stopping the Dakota Access Pipeline, among other struggles with Native American peoples. Judith, kind of cut her political teeth on the Wounded Knee. And she was one of the people who lived at Wounded Knee in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time is when she decided to join the Communist Party. And she told me that it was because of the communists that she met at Wounded Knee that she wanted to become a member of the CPUSA. And so, so again, to challenge this historical narrative, this false historical narrative that the Communist Party became a marginal political force post-1956.
And I thought something interesting, I think it was in your book, Tony, you were talking about the county where Wounded Knee is like the poorest per capita county in the United States. I mean, with the poverty and, we don't realize how these tribes today are still living in horrible situations. And so she seems like just quite a remarkable person. Moving right along, your last one you liked so much, you wrote a book about him. And tell us about Alpheus Hutton, and he's the sixth of your biography, and then your book is a deep dive into his works, which is really great. So
thank you. Well, Alpheus Hunton came from a long line of activists. His mother and father and his sister, all in their own right, activists, well-known activists in their own right. But Alpheus was a Howard University professor who in 1936 joined the Communist Party and simultaneously was a leader of what was called the National Negro Congress, which was probably the largest Black Popular Front organization of the period, with hundreds and hundreds of coalition members representing millions and millions of African Americans. And so Alpheus Hunton, in his role as a professor at Howard University and as a leader of the National Negro Congress, fought to, just like today, there was instances of police brutality and police murder in the Washington, D.C. area. And so Hunton was one of the core leaders of the NNC's campaign to blast Jim Crow out of DC and to hold police accountable for the misuse and abuse of police power. Oftentimes, many of the African Americans that were murdered at the hands of the police, were shot in the back, very reminiscent of the police killings today, and Black Lives Matter response to those killings. But then in 1943, Alpheus decides to leave Howard University, move to New York City, and eventually become the executive director of what is called the Council on African Affairs. Now, the Council on African Affairs, unlike the NNC, was more of an educational institution. It did not have a mass membership like the National Negro Congress. But what it did was it would partner with the NNC, it would partner with the National Maritime Union, it would partner with other party-affiliated Popular Front groups and unions to bring international pressure to bear against racist, it wasn't an official apartheid state at that time, but against what would become South African apartheid. And so from 1943 till 1955, Alpheus Hunton was basically the key linchpin in this organization called the Council on African Affairs, which included people as prominent as Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Louise Thompson Patterson, wife of William L. Patterson, who was the leader of the Civil Rights Congress. And so Hunton's story is phenomenal. He throughout this period, he also works with the Civil Rights Congress and was a signatory to the CRC We Charge Genocide petition. And he was a member of the CRC Bail Fund, which, the Civil Rights Congress, like the National Alliance 20 years later, fought against racist and political repression, but also fought to free the victims of Smith Act, the Communist Party victims of the Smith Act. And so as a member of this bail fund, Hunton is called to testify. He refuses to divulge the names of CRC contributors and ultimately spends 6 months in jail for refusing to release the names of contributors to the Civil Rights Congress Bail Fund. And that's in 1951. He's jailed in July 1951, released in December. And then by 1955, the Civil Rights, the Council on African Affairs tragically becomes a victim of the McCarthy era repression and is unable to continue its work on behalf of African American equality and Black liberation. Alpheus, however, doesn't stop his work. By 1957, he publishes a groundbreaking book, Decision in Africa, Sources of Current Conflict, which was published a decade, 12, maybe 15 years prior to Walter Rodney's classic book, How the West Underdeveloped Africa. And so Hunton publishes that book, which W.E.B. Du Bois writes a foreword for. And then by 1960, Hunton decides to relocate to Ghana after Du Bois asks him to relocate to Ghana to help with the Encyclopedia Africana. Hunton spends 6 years in Ghana until the coup ousts Kwame Nkrumah, and then Hunton and his wife Dorothy come back to New York for just a little while. Then they go back to Africa. They end up in Zambia, where Hunton helps with the ANC, African National Congress Underground Bulletin. He writes a history of the resistance, liberation movements of Africa, and eventually he dies of cancer in 1970. I wanted to really focus on Hunton's life because he has been one of the most neglected, if I can use that word. He really has been neglected in the history of African-American struggle for not only civil rights and equality, but for Black liberation in Africa. And so, and the book, The Cancer of Colonialism, takes its name from an article that Hunton wrote in 1945 for the Communist Party's paper, The Daily Worker. And so what I tried to do with The Cancer of Colonialism is give a brief history of the impact of colonialism, and then tell a brief biography of Hunton, as well as reprint all of Hunton's Daily Worker articles from 1944 to 1946, which was the period in time in which he wrote regular weekly or biweekly columns for the Daily Worker.
And he kind of greased the skids for breaking up South Africa and apartheid, and kind of he laid the foundation for what would eventually occur there. And you know, that's, I think it was in your book, but that, you know, that was just like a concentration camp in South Africa. You would have white miners and Black miners side by side, with the Black miners making a 15th of what the white miners would make, doing the same exact job.
Yeah.
And what I found was so interesting in looking at apartheid is the mental set of the South Africans. You know, the white South Africans, they just truly felt that Blacks weren't necessarily inferior, they were just less developed. They needed to be nurtured, and that is the spirit of your book on colonialism. And that was the whole mindset of colonialism. We're just here to help these poor people, and they'll be fine maybe in a while, but we need to nurture them because they definitely are lesser than us.
I mean, lest they come to the wrong conclusion and maybe lean towards liberation and socialism. Like that was part of, you know, coupled with this fear, you know, this belief of inferiority was also this fear that you know, they may lean towards socialism. They may lean towards liberation movements that were given considerable aid by the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations. And so, you know, that is also kind of interwoven into this history of Hunton and the struggle against colonialism that I try to make clear in The Cancer of Colonialism.
Yeah. Tony, how did you become an activist?
Well, if we go back 20 some odd years, 22, 23, 24 years, I really cut my teeth as an activist at the St. Louis Community College. You know, I don't have a degree. I don't have any sort of you know, nothing like that. I never graduated college. I only attended a few semesters of community college. But while at community college in St. Louis, I wrote for the campus newspaper and was on the editorial board of the campus newspaper. And while I was there, we got wind of the fact that the Board of Trustees hoped to increase the tuition for students by some astronomical amount, you know, 30 or 40% tuition increase. And so in my capacity as a journalist on the campus newspaper, I began writing these scathing articles. Students demand no tuition increase. I'd go around during lunchtime and interview students and get their direct quotes about how much tuition cost and how it's unfair that the you know, the head of the school made so much money, but you know, they want to pass the cost on to us as students and that type of thing. And then eventually I decided to publish all of the home phone numbers of the Board of Trustees members.
Oh, goodness.
And encourage all the students to call and leave messages demanding no tuition increase. And so we were able to force the Board of Trustees to hold a public hearing on the tuition increase. Ultimately, we were unsuccessful. We weren't able to stop the tuition increase, but out of that campaign, I got in touch with a number of people from the Service Employees Union, from Jobs with Justice, from the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and other folks who were interested in this kind of confluence between student activism and labor activism in St. Louis. And that's where I happened to meet members and leaders of the St. Louis Communist Party. And it was that cadre of Black communists in St. Louis who really mentored me and helped to guide my political development throughout the early 2000s. And, you know, I became a organizer with the Service Employees Union for a couple of years, and I worked in their communications department. I would travel around the state of Missouri doing the various newsletters for the, at that time, 3 different Service Employees Union locals, 2 in St. Louis and 1 in Kansas City, that represented, you know, the janitorial workers, probation parole officers, the graveyards, groundkeepers. I mean, I was just going everywhere, talking with regular workers and trying to put their story into the union newsletters that we published. And so I kind of went from being a muckracker journalist on campus to doing the same thing, you know, telling the workers' stories for the union. Ultimately, I moved on to work full-time for the Communist Party here in Missouri, and the rest is history.
You know, this is a question for both you, Greg, and you, Tony. It's the importance of newspapers, pamphlets. The Communist Party, when you look at the history of it, it's this. There's a lot of writing. They did a lot of writing. I guess the pamphlet is now the blog or the Substack. And if you read them both in the past and currently, I read Greg's blog all the time and the Marxist-Leninist Today that he publishes. Most of it is not that radical. It's a common sense economics. It's this idea of stopping wealth from going to a smaller percentage of people and having people have a say in their work and organizing and civil rights. And I mean, none of it seems too obtuse, too hard to grasp. I don't know, what are your thoughts about the importance of pamphlets, newspapers, writing as a cohesive force to support the themes of the socialist communist movement? Am I right?
I think it's absolutely imperative that we, you know, write and publish and argue and put those you know, ideological perspectives forward, if for no other reason than for ourselves, you know, if so we can document the history of our resistance to the things that we see as being unjust. But I think it goes beyond that. I think that we can look at, as you said, many of the things that communists or socialists advocate for really do seem like common sense. They're not that radical if we lived in a rational world. I mean, it's not that radical to not want our Earth to be destroyed by pollution. I mean, that's not a radical concept, right? You know, at least I don't think that it is. It's not a radical concept to believe in the sanctity of democracy and that African Americans and women and people of color should all contribute, you know, be a part of democracy to the fullest extent possible, you know, LGBTQ community, et cetera. And so these aren't radical ideas. And it's really, I think, just it's important for us to be able to document and to highlight the history of these ideas, to bring them forward, to show that there's this, you know, this continuation, this long, people call it, today they call it the long struggle for civil rights, for example, right? And if we look at the history of the Communist Party from the campaign to free the Scottsboro Nine, to the National Negro Congress, to the Council on African Affairs, to the Civil Rights Congress, to the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, to you know, organizing today around Black Lives Matter, you see this this continuity of struggle, where communists have been in the forefront of and a part of all of these struggles. And so we have to document those things because as Let Them Tremble argues, other people aren't going to document it for us.
Right.
Right.
Tony, this has been a real treat. You are a remarkable person. I learned an awful lot from you. I learned a lot from you. I'll link to the books. I encourage everybody to pick up your books and to follow you. What's a good blog link for you? Just your writings on People's World, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a blog. Maybe I should start one. But I do write, fairly regularly for the People's World. I've been writing regularly for Black Perspectives these past couple of months. I hope to continue to do that. Yeah.
Good.
Maybe I should start a blog.
I will link to Greg's blog, which is one of my favorite blogs, and I will. That's a good place to get more information too. So thank you so much, Tony. This has just been wonderful and informative, and I wish you luck, and I want you to, keep up the fight.
Thanks,
Thank
Tony.
you for having me.
All right.
Thanks,
All right.
Tony. Keep the tradition alive.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.